Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Berton. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Hamilton Spectator and the spec.com, and it is my privilege to welcome you here tonight. And it is a particular pleasure for me because we share, all of you and all of us here at the Spectator, an abiding interest in education, of course. It meshes nicely with what we do here. But I think we also share a campaign with the Community Foundation to make education as accessible as possible, and we've in fact partnered on that many times in the past, as you know. So I was happy when asked to welcome you here tonight, and as I said, it's a great privilege, and I would like to now welcome Terry Cooke up to introduce the rest of the evening. Thank you. Paul Berton and I share not only passion for education, but the same barber. Thank you, Paul, for those kind remarks. I am always mindful that when we come to the Spectator, that we do share a passion for community. And so much of our history of the Community Foundation has been really supported and deepened by particularly the investigative work that's been done by Steve Bust and Terry Bukowski and Neil Johnson and others around poverty and neighborhoods, and more recently around educational outcomes. And so as a lover of newspapers who grew up buying my weekend New York Times and Cleveland Plain Dealer and Detroit Free Press at Hopkins Variety in Westdale so that I could learn what was happening in other communities, I put a particular value on communities and newspapers in mid-sized cities that are struggling with a difficult business model but remain committed to good journalism that makes a difference. And we are proud of the partnership, Paul, so thank you. This is a continuing series for us at the Community Foundation. It's called Driving Positive Change. It is supported by the Carolyn Milne Leadership Fund that was created to honor the service of my predecessor, Carolyn Milne, who did such a remarkable job in helping to advance the work of our foundation and really was the early inspiration to do much of the neighborhood's work on which Abacus is predicated. I want to particularly recognize tonight our partners in education, because so much of what we do only succeeds if we have engaged parents, supportive advocates, teachers who are committed to making a difference, and partners with both boards of education. And I would recognize a couple of the trustees who are here tonight. I know Joe Bayardo is here from the separate board, and Penny Deeth from the public board. I also see Judith Bishop, our former Ward 1 school trustee that I served with. Judith was there more recently, but in my case it was a lifetime ago, a couple of careers back, who continues to make a profound difference, and to Manny Figueredo, who is our Director of Education and a member of the Community Foundation Board. Tonight, we want to set this up by telling you a little bit more about our 10-year, $10 million commitment to Abacus, our commitment to advancing educational outcomes for all students in Hamilton, but particularly with a focus on those kids who come with particular challenges. That work really was done in partnership with Fairmount Foundation, Heidi Balsillie, and the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, people like Fiona Deller, and it's been led by our staff team, led especially by Matthew Goodman, but also by Sarah Glen, who is going to speak to you now, and by Jen Pearson, who's with us here tonight. And they have forged, I think, really strong and enduring partnerships with our educational partners that I think over time is going to make a difference. So the next part of this agenda is to introduce my friend Annie Kidder, but we're going to make you just wait a moment, suspended animation, Annie, and it'll be worth the wait, take my word for it. But right now I would like to ask Sarah Glen to come forward to give you an update on the 2 years of work that we have now committed and some of the results that we're seeing in our Abacus program. Sarah, please come forward, and would you join me in welcoming Sarah Glen.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for tonight's conversation. So, what is Abacus? As Terry mentioned, Abacus is HCF's 10-year commitment to improving high school graduation rates and access to post-secondary education, including trades and apprenticeships. The strategy focuses the Foundation's collective efforts on grades 6, 7, and 8, and transition into high school. The middle school years are a time of many developmental changes, and research shows that it is this time in a young person's life, those critical middle school years, where they begin to make choices about whether or not high school and the future of post-secondary education is meant for them. Our local community scan also indicated that there was a gap in the programs and services that focused on the middle school years in Hamilton. So as Terry mentioned, Abacus was launched in 2015 in partnership with the Fairmount Foundation. The research was conducted by Fiona Deller, the Senior Executive Director of Research and Policy for the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, also known as HECO. And HECO continues to support our strategy with its ongoing implementation as part of our project team. So, what is Abacus? Abacus is based on 4 pillars of successful early intervention programs. So that's academic upskilling, mentoring, goal setting, and incentives. Everything we do at HCF related to Abacus is focused in the following ways. You can see that up there. So expanding community capacity through granting, grad track, and supporting systems change. We've granted around $3 million over the past 3 years, but dollars out the door only paint one part of the picture. Through Abacus, we're granting with a difference. We're looking to learn alongside our grantees, some of them who are in the room this evening, and we really want to discover with them what works, for whom, and in what way. So ways that we're doing that is we're really reframing, or hoping to reframe, the relationship between funder and grantee. We've pulled together our grantees in a community of practice where we can really come together and share our ideas on topics of interest and really start to learn from each other. Educational forums like this one and our partnerships with organizations like People for Education are yet another way where we can start to think more strategically about how to shift our practice in order to benefit equitable access to post-secondary education for all students. The second component of Abacus is our grad track pilot, and it's really meant to support a small number of disengaging middle school students to learn how to navigate the system, access the resources they need, set goals, and create individualized educational pathways with the support and guidance of our grad track learning coach. That's Jen Pearson, and she's just over there. Give a little wave, Jen. Grad track is currently working with about 20 students in 2 schools, one in each of our school boards, and it launched in the fall of 2016. The final component of Abacus is addressing systemic barriers. So we're really looking to better understand the tensions and challenges embedded within the educational system overall. Adopting a learning focus and placing ourselves at the intersection of our community grant making as well as our pilot grad track project has really helped us begin to understand where we may be able to support or assist our partners in greater systems change, like building in some of the elements that People for Education and Annie is going to talk to you about today. So for HCF, it's really important to understand what is and isn't working within Abacus. Our evaluation of Abacus aims to help us better understand the impact the work will make, not only to increasing graduation rates, but also in the development of resilience and protective factors like self-understanding, self-regulation, peer support networks, the development of trust, among others. Think of these protective factors and these characteristics like an internal GPS. Research shows that young people need them to navigate the system successfully and achieve their goals. They're just as important, and some would argue even more important than good grades and regular attendance. So we're paying really close attention to them in our evaluation. Our long-standing and deep relationships with both the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board and Hamilton Wentworth Catholic District School Board has allowed us to open up spaces for dialogue in ways that we've never done before. These relationships and others, like our partnership with People for Education, are the cornerstone of our work with Abacus. I like to say that Abacus is really built from the minds and hands of many people. And together with our partners and the support and direction of our board of directors and donors, we do have collective hope that we're going to make, hopefully, a lasting difference in the lives of students in Hamilton. So what I've shared with you tonight is just a really quick overview of Abacus. And if you're interested in learning more, please check out our website. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that great setup, Sarah, and for providing some context for the presentation that we're going to hear from Annie. I would also be remiss if I didn't build on Sarah's observation that we've been able to do this work at the Community Foundation because we've had a history of good board leadership that's been willing to stick their neck out on a couple of big issues that have made a difference. Initially with poverty in neighborhoods, and subsequently with this unprecedented commitment to trying to change educational outcomes for all students in this community. And I should recognize a number of former board chairs and present board chairs who are with us and who have served so well. Terry Yates, Dr. Gary Warner, Brent Foreman, and our present board chair, Teresa Smith, who you will hear from later in the program. But I know there are probably other board members here, and if I've missed you, I'll endeavor to make up for that error as we go along. Let me now turn to the highlight of the evening, which is going to be initially a presentation by Annie Kidder, followed by a Q&A that we hope you will all join us in participating in. Annie has become a good friend of both this community and this foundation. We had dinner earlier today, and we were reminiscing about where we came from and what shaped our passion for education. And in my case, as many of you know, I had no choice. I had a grandmother who chaired the school board here, a dad who was a high school teacher, and a little sister who was an elementary principal. It was the family business, and whether I wanted to or not, I came to appreciate early that education was going to be a premium in our household. Annie attended 12 different schools in the course of her academic career. She was the daughter of a miner who moved around the country, but her first passion was in fact in theater and performing arts, and she came to Toronto initially to pursue that career with her husband, but ultimately because her kids were involved in the public school system at a time of tumultuous change in this province, she engaged in learning about the educational system and I think developed a passion for the difference that public education can contribute for all citizens. And she has become, without question, in my opinion, the most forceful and articulate advocate for the importance of public education in this country. She continues to be an advisor to governments, to NGOs, to education ministries across the country and around the world. She's spoken at conferences in all parts of the globe. But I think most importantly for this community, her organization, People for Education, is now engaged in a very strong partnership with us in Abacus to see what we can learn from our experience in this community that is transmittable to schools and educational settings across the country. I am really pleased and proud of the friendship that she's provided, the support and the guidance that she is providing to us as we go along this journey in Hamilton. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome with you our friend Annie Kidder to Hamilton tonight.
Okay, we're done. There. So now I'm going to break something, I can tell. Is this something really important that I shouldn't touch? Can I put it down here? It is really important. It's a microphone. Now I did touch it. Okay. Thank you very much, Terry. Just because I have nowhere to put this. And I think the thing I want to say first is I feel like there's something in the water in Hamilton. I never really knew that much about Hamilton before. I don't think before I met Terry, who I'm sure it's fine. I'm flexible. I'm a woman. I can figure it out. But since talking to Terry and starting to come here and learning more and more about Hamilton, and Toronto has a director of education that also came from here. We have a researcher who was educated at McMaster. But the more I learn about Hamilton and the work that's happening in Hamilton and the capacity that Hamilton has, for whatever reason, the water, I don't know, to understand interconnectedness, the more impressed I am. So it is so much fun to work with the Hamilton Community Foundation because they really, lots of people say they're a learning organization, but they really truly are. We had a fantastic meeting this afternoon that was wonderfully messy and exciting and feeding off each other and going, well, then we could do this. But I think that there's a kind of openness, but especially a willingness to connect. And I can't tell you how important that is. And I come now from the world of education, which has a tendency to live in its little box in a silo, to have a really hard time talking to anybody else. I spend a lot of time going to education conferences where everybody stands around and goes, we know various things. But it's like we know these things, but we don't want to tell anybody else. So I really think that you should all know how fabulous this place is that you live, how great the Community Foundation is, and we are so excited to be working on this project because it's a way of thinking about taking evidence in some cases, being willing to take risks, being willing to experiment, to try to understand, as Sarah explained, what we can really do to start sort of moving the needle in education. I'm going to take a second to explain a little bit more about People for Education and then talk a bit about why, to me, public education provides a kind of path to hope in a world that can seem not that hopeful often these days. So we are a nonprofit organization. We did start more than 20 years ago. We started at a time when there were a lot of polarized debates in education. And I think that over the years, we have evolved over the years, and I think that what's different about us as an education organization is that we are not so much about the inside as we are about the outside. So for us, the conversation kind of starts with, what kind of country do we want to live in, or what kind of world do we want to live in, and then what kind of province, what kind of community do we want to live in, and in that case, what's the role of education in that way? So we've been doing our work, doing research, conducting research, surveying all the schools in the province, trying to be a kind of a critical friend of the public education system, sometimes very critical and sometimes very friendly. But because we're on the outside of the system, we're able, like the Hamilton Community Foundation, to take risks, to try stuff, to try to discover what makes a difference. And again, for us, it starts with the country, and it starts with thinking about what do we need. And I think that if we look at the world right now, and I loved Sarah's description of these things as things that kids should have as protective factors. People talk about these things in a lot of different ways, transferable skills, 21st century skills. But I think that what we're sure of in Canada is that we need new generations with the capacity to imagine, to adapt, to continue to learn, to solve the incredibly complex problems we have right now, to be able to think about how we begin to close both economic gaps and social gaps, to be healthier mentally and physically. We need new generations who are going to be able to change jobs multiple times, and to deal with a globalization which in some ways is great and in some ways causes kind of critical problems. And maybe ultimately what we need, I have a 25-year-old who sounds like kind of like Terry's 14-year-old, who tells me at great length how my generation ruined the world. And it's like, thank you so very much. And she's very disappointed in our generation. And I think that she's right in a way, that somehow our ideals didn't end up sticking in the way one would have hoped. And we know that the world is a messy place, and we're going to need new generations with different kinds of skills. And that's how how we think of the role of public education. I think that the other thing that's important, or part of what kind of grounds us, is remembering the connection between Canada and public education. Now, Senator Murray Sinclair has a great quote where he says, when he was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and one of the things he says is education caused these problems, and education is the solution to these problems. But I think it's important to remember that we are unique in the world in Canada, in that we have an immense kind of buy-in to. It's great when you have slides because you can never remember which one comes next, and it's like maybe it'll be the right one, and it is. That in Canada we are extraordinary in the world. In a lot of the world, their public education, there are fewer and fewer students proportionally inside public education systems. But in Canada, still 95% of our kids go to public school. And I think it's important for us to remember when we think about how special we are as Canadians, which I happen to believe, that when we were becoming a country, when they were sitting around deciding how we were going to join Upper and Lower Canada and have a responsible government, they knew way back then in 1837 that there had to be a public education system, that Ryerson, who did cause problems but was the initial kind of founder of public education in Canada, understood that if you were going to have a responsible government, you had to have educated voters. He talked about educating the blacksmith's son and the magistrate's son alike. He didn't talk about daughters, but he was a man of his time. And he has a great quote, which is very important to remember, which also comes next, because he knew that the role of public education had to do with democracy, and he understood, and this is very apt these days, that an ignorant population are liable to be the dupes of demagogues. And he said this more than 150 years ago, and if you look at some examples of some other countries that might be quite close to ours, where they have pretty well destroyed their public education system, that maybe it's not a causal result, but you can see what happens in some cases when you're not making sure that you have this incredibly educated population, and especially a population where we're all educated together, rich, poor, in the north, in the south, in rural areas, in cities, that for the most part, 95% of us go to public schools. So the hope part of this conversation is important too. So when we're thinking about the job of public education, I think that it is important that we kind of think about all of the various messes that we're in right now, and the real worry that our younger generations have about the state of the world. I have a 30-year-old too who's going, should I have children? We have a world that's really divided economically, socially. We have incredible amounts of wealth and incredible amounts of poverty. We've got climate change. We have a lot of people in Canada struggling with their mental health. We know that we have people also that are physically less healthy than they have been in the past. We have a low voter turnout now that sometimes goes up and down, but it's particularly low for younger people. So we have a lot of things that we're dealing with and a lot of kind of worrying aspects of the world. We have this. And I think that when we remember, it's easy to kind of laugh, but I think that partly the current president is a result of a terrible divide in the population, and we are not immune to that in Canada. We're seeing it right now with people talking about their schools closing in rural areas. We've done a lot of work looking at public education in rural areas in the north, and ending up with parts of the population that feel left out or that nobody cares about them this is partly what you get. So when we think about this, we have to remember that great quote, because it's important that we remember, again, the job of public education. But to us, that is where the hope lies as well. So for us, the hope comes in two ways. One has to do with individuals in the system, and that's part of, and Abacus wonderfully kind of embodies the two ways, because it talks about the kids that are in grad track and that they're looking at, but it's also trying to think about what does that mean overall? What does it mean for all of the kids, and what does it mean for our next generations? And for us, it's important that the hope isn't in, the children, because they're going to save us from our terrible decisions. It's not the children that are the hope. It's actually ensuring that we have systems in place that are thinking of themselves as, or taking on the responsibility of kind of having a role in ensuring we have the next generations we need. So part of the hope is in the promise of public education, which is that it should have the capacity to overcome intergenerational cycles of poverty. It should be able to build a sense of social cohesion, to allow us to have a deeper understanding of each other in all our kind of diversity and our diverse perspectives. And it should also provide every child, every single child, no matter where they were born, or the income of their parents, or the language that they speak, or their learning needs, or their gender, or their race, or their ethnicity, that the promise of public education is that every single child will have a chance to succeed. And we have to really take on that promise. And again, I'm going to sound like an ad for the Hamilton Community Foundation, but that's all right. I think that it's important that we understand that we have it's important that we take that job seriously, and sometimes we kind of forget. And I talk to other people in education who worry that we haven't kind of moved the equity needle for a long time, that still the biggest predictor of whether or not you're going to succeed in school is your socioeconomic status. And that shouldn't still be the biggest predictor, and we have to figure out what we're going to do about that. So for us, there is hope in public education and in all the children in public education, but there is also a problem right now. So again, those big goals, saving the world, dealing with a world that's rapidly changing. But our problem right now is that we still have quite narrowly defined goals and narrowly defined measures of success. So we still, look to the newspaper and we look for that up good, down bad graph, and we judge the whole system on it. Famously, a person whose name I won't mention, but a former MP announced that it was a national emergency, that our ranking had gone down by 2 places in math in the PISA scores internationally. But on the other hand, where there was no announcement of a national emergency when only a third of young people were voting. And I think that those are the kinds of things we have to watch in the system right now, that we love. I was talking to the chair of your board about how we love a nice, easy measure. And in health, too, there have been measures that then end up skewing what you're doing inside the system. So reading, writing, and math are incredibly important. I think that goes without saying, and nobody's going to tell you who cares whether kids can read, write, and do math. But back to Sarah's point about now I've forgotten what they're called again, protective factors. There are other foundational competencies and skills that may actually be more important because they lay the groundwork, they provide that foundation so that everybody can keep on learning. And being able to keep on learning in today's world is a vital thing to be able to do. And so for us, when we've been looking at the education system and starting off with this idea that we've got a problem because of the goals that we've set in the system and because the way that we measure success in the system, that we started to think about, what could we do about that? So we worried that it wasn't living up to its promise in that way in terms of all of those other broader kind of skills. When we were looking at that, we were thinking about then what do we need to do, and what are those other areas so that we can have kids who can live without fear, who can understand other perspectives, who can imagine, who can understand our connection to each other and the world around us, who are problem solvers, and who are able to take their place in the world in a stronger way, where they feel that they have the capacity to function in that way. And when we first kind of thought about this, we had a pretty simplistic theory of change, which is we've got really, really narrow goals, we have narrow measures, what we need is a different way of looking at the education system, and that our theory of change went kind of like this, that public education is the lever for change in society, that measurement, accountability structures are the lever for change in public education, because that's where the policy, the pressure, the accountability, the promises you make politically that we're going to get these scores up to X or Y, that's where they come from. And that if that's true, if those are the levers, then how do we work on that part? And again, it's partly our backwards way of working, that rather than getting inside the system and going, how do we change the curriculum in grade 6 in X or Y, it's more, what do we need to do from both ways, from the sort of top down and bottom up, to begin to look at how we articulate our goals and our measures of success differently. So we worked with a lot of different researchers from across Canada, experts in various areas. We have developed, and that's what we're going to work on with Grad Track, a set of very, very concrete competencies in each of these areas: citizenship, creativity, health, and social emotional learning, and also a description of what a quality learning environment is, because it can't just be about the outcomes, it has to be about what are the opportunities, how are we ensuring that the context is there, that we are setting up places where kids can learn, where they can experience a sense of agency, and also places that are able to work in a connected way with communities. And so I think that one of the things for us about these competencies is that these are not characteristics that you're born with. You're not born creative or born with a sense of citizenship. These are teachable, learnable skills. And one of the equity pieces in this, I don't know if I can quite articulate this yet because we're kind of wrestling with this, is that we know from things like the EDI, the Early Development Instrument, and other measures, that kids come into school with different levels, if you will, of these competencies. And that part of the inequity is, I'm me, and it's not that I'm so fabulous or anything, but I can provide my children with some of these competencies because I have money, I have education, I can send them to other classes, and they come into school with more of these competencies and skills than some other kids do. And if we continue to ignore that and just measure whether or not we can get their reading scores up by grade 3, we will never move the equity needle. And this is part of the thing that we really want to try and look at and wrestle with, that it's important that we look at equity from a lot of perspectives, but if we're only ever measuring equity from whether or not kids' reading, writing, and math scores go up, we may still never equip them to be able to go have a job, keep a job, live in the world, vote, feel that they're able to be, as anybody else can be, a sort of engaged citizen. So that the competencies inside these things, in creativity, for instance, interestingly for me, who comes from a theater background, the competencies in creativity are really kind of hardcore. They're not like, I just dream up fabulous things. They are about a process. They're about persistence. It made me finally understand what critical thinking was, because I've always said critical thinking is important, but I really never actually got it, because it has to do with being able to, for instance, work without an end goal in mind. So I invent a problem without an end goal in mind and work on that problem, and then look at your product critically, ask other people about it, persist, change it, keep on working on it. So that the skills within creativity, yes, they work in theater and film and fine arts, but they also work all the way across the board. They're not about being a creative person. They are about hard, real, observable, concrete skills. And one of the things we've been finding as we've been working with teachers is that if you work really hard to define these things, then they can talk to each other, then they can talk to kids, they can collaborate with each other, but also kids go, oh, I'm learning that, I know how I can work on that in a different way. It has to, of course, go with knowledge. It's not, instead of knowledge or on Friday afternoons we do creativity, it's a way of working with the curriculum. Citizenship, We have a citizenship scholar who I love, who you should get to come and talk here, whose name's Alan Sears, and he's a sort of nerdy-looking guy from the University of New Brunswick, and he is the most passionate, ardent, loud advocate of citizenship skills. And what I love about him is he goes, we should be teaching kids how to not get along. Because for him, in the world we live in right now, back to the scary slides, there's a lot of not getting along and a lot of feeling that I'm on this side, I'm right, I don't have to listen to you. But when he is thinking about citizenship, for him it's understanding and learning how to live within diversities of opinion, of perspective, being able to listen to each other and being able to not get along. And one of the other things he says that I love is that we give citizenship skills to citizenship awards to kids for sitting down, shutting up, and being good. And that is the opposite of citizenship skills. We should be giving them awards for being loud, for rebelling, for being mouthy, for bringing their perspective to your child should get citizenship awards. Because we have the wrong idea of what citizenship is. And in today's world, if we don't learn that sense of empathy, perspective, have the experience of agency, which is part of what citizenship skills build. So it's not about teaching about how government works. You should teach everybody about how government works. But it's also for kids to experience their own sense of agency. So you can't just teach citizenship skills. You have to actually have the context and the opportunity to experience them. So you have to have schools where kids really truly have a voice, where they understand the responsibility of having that voice, where they make mistakes and screw up and are able to go back and look at that again. And all of these things start when you're 4 years old. You can talk about all these things and think about these things from kindergarten. The health piece is obviously incredibly important, but we miss it a lot in education. We've been watching over the years, because again, we survey all the schools, the kind of gradual decline in the percentage of schools with health and phys ed teachers who have specific knowledge in these areas. And a kind of sense, principals write lots of comments on our surveys that things get squeezed out. Again, the problem with having these narrow goals. If I've got to get my scores up in math or reading because I'm getting hell from the parents or the board or the province or the newspaper, then I'm going to go, well, maybe, phys ed isn't the most important thing right now. So we've again, deconstructed all the competencies in phys ed that have to do with managing, risk-taking, understanding, of course, your body and your own health, sexuality, understanding mental illness. This one isn't about mental health. The next one is so that you can actually recognize it in yourself. It's a lot about relationships. So it's a basket, as we know now that we're grown-ups. Health isn't just one thing again that you can do on Friday morning, though that's how I treat it. But it doesn't really work. I think that one of the most interesting areas has to do with social emotional learning. And for me, part of my education has been a whole discovery to me, because it's not the land that I came from, that when kids are in kindergarten, we measure and care about and take very, very seriously all of their social emotional skills and knowledge and development. We care really, really a lot about how they communicate, if they understand their own feelings, if they're able to empathize with others, how they have relationships. We're thinking of them in a way that's all about their development. And then they hit grade 1 and they would go, poof, that's it. We don't care about that stuff anymore. That's for kindergarten. Now we're down to the serious stuff. But in fact, the evidence is incredibly strong that these skills are vitally important in our lives. And we have a tendency in these days to talk about mental health when we're really talking about mental illness. But if we were really talking about mental health, and if we were really thinking about this, we would understand, and it's not that this is a panacea and is going to prevent anybody from ending up struggling with mental illness later on, but for a lot of people, young people in particular, that if we had a world and schools where part of the learning, deep, serious learning, starting when you're in junior kindergarten, was about understanding your feelings, being able to understand and have a kind of understand yourself in the world, understand what you're capable of and what you're not, how to ask for help, but particularly being able to be introspective even too, that then it doesn't come as a terrible shock suddenly when you're 13 and everything starts to fall apart and you don't have any capacity to deal with it. And we watch kids as they enter those transition years of puberty and later on, and I have watched it a lot personally, where things really, really, really fall apart, but we haven't seen it as part of the job of the education system because, again, we see those as outside of learning, when in fact, those competencies and skills, again, allow you to keep on learning. So those are the important pieces that we've been looking at. Again, for us, it's thinking about them as teachable and learnable, and then working out ways for being able to transform or work slowly. Transformation doesn't happen in a kind of poof. Sadly, that's the kind of thing I like, but we agreed this afternoon when we were talking, and this is a slow process. But what we are finding with the teachers we've been working with and with superintendents and with directors is that it's very exciting for them to have these things, again, defined in a concrete way, and to be able to have support to add them to their work. Now, it's going to take change in the system because you have to build in time to do this. We have to change what we expect of the system and what we want it to be accountable for, because we have to understand that employers are saying these are the kinds of people we need, people who can collaborate, who are resilient, who are persistent, who can work with other people, who are empathetic, because it's way better for selling people things if you're empathetic. I learned this from young entrepreneurs. It seems like a terrible way to think of empathy, but it works for them. That employers are saying this. They're saying that kids are graduating from university not actually knowing how to describe the skills they have. They know, I've got an honors degree, what's your problem? You should give me a job. But they can't, and they know what marks they got in all their courses, but they don't know whether or not they have all these other skills because they haven't been articulated either in kindergarten to grade 12 education or in university or in college. College is actually better at it. So that we're not, kids aren't thinking about what they're learning in these ways. We're not talking to them about that in those ways, and we're not thinking enough systematically about how we are building those skills. So again, for me, this is where the hope lies. In a world that can, some mornings when you wake up and read the newspaper, feel pretty damn hopeless, but the hope lies in all of us doing it. And it goes back to, and I think Sarah or Terry talked about connecting the dots, that we can't just think of this as education's job. We have to understand all of our future depends on it. We have to understand that what's great about public education is it's a system, and you can actually shift, though it's very hard, systems. That's why we can't just sit back and go, let's hope the next generation does a better job. We can shift this system if we work on it, but we have to think of it, again, as all of our responsibility, whether you're a truck driver or the head of a hospital or running a foundation or wherever you come from. You're not, just because you don't have kids in school anymore or you're not in school yourself, you are still attached to the products of our public education system, and we have a chance if we work together to begin to articulate broader goals to ensure that kids have the capacities that they need and that we need in order to make sure that our world lasts. Thank you. Now do I go over there?
You come on over here with me.
I had to take my microphone off and put it in my pocket because it fell off. But I'm sure.
Are we live here? What a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, and thereafter we have a couple of floor mics, and all I would ask you to do is stand up, raise your hand, somebody will bring a mic